So we are going to continue here with the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus. I believe this is part 4. And thus far we've been talking about Protagoras and his conceptions of what is true to the individual, that man is the measure of all things. Another part of his theory is that all things are in motion. There's an extensive discussion earlier in this podcast, obviously, about these things. Surely we will cover similar ground here as we continue to talk about it. So let's begin. Socrates says, "We may also suggest that the theory would stand firm most successfully in the position which we sketched out for it in our attempt to bring help to Protagoras. I mean the position that most things are for the individual what they seem to him to be. For instance, warm, dry, sweet, and all this type of thing. But if the theory is going to admit that there is any sphere in which one man is superior to another, it might perhaps be prepared to grant it in questions of what is good or bad for one's health. Here it might well be admitted that it is not true that every creature, woman or child or even animal, is competent to recognize what is good for it and to heal its own sickness. That here, if anywhere, one person is better than another. Do you agree?" Theodorus says, "Yes, that seems to me so." So now we are trying to salvage what we can out of Protagoras' characterization of how human beings perceive their environment. Because it seems as though the information that is taken up by the individual and ordered in such a way that allows him to come to some sort of knowing and understanding perception is also in some sense unique to that individual. I think pain perception is a good one. Pain can often be something that is in some sense straightforward. If there is an injury, it is likely that not only the person experiencing the pain, but also somebody outside of the individual would be able to identify the area that is producing pain. Of course, if it has some sort of external characteristics that may suggest that it would. Some breach in the skin, for example, or an obvious fracture in a bone. But there are also cases in which the individual may suffer from pain that is separate from any observable pathology, whether that be internal or external. And that may be because of, at one point, there was an injury that lasted for a period of time that led to some systemic or structural changes, perhaps, within the mind that leads the mind into the mode of perception that is not necessarily representative of the physical state of things. Now, chronic pain is a strange phenomenon. But I think it goes along with the example that we had earlier about the man who is sick versus the man who is healthy. That the man is sick, he loses his ability to smell, to taste. And yet, his perception, what he can perceive of the world, is true for him. The sensory organs are not working as they should. And perhaps the nerves that carry that information, they may be impacted by the infection, the viral infection, and now the state of being is such that the information that he takes in has been reduced relative to the individual that can experience the fullness of his food. For example, he can smell his food, he can taste it, and taste all the variability, the sweetness, the saltiness, and so forth. And so we come to a point of recognition. We're trying to save a part of this theory, but we are also admitting that in its totality, the individual experience is not the measure of all that is. Having said that, there are things within the individual experience that we may keep, that the individual perhaps is the best judge of. Now we have one example here of where this may not be true. In the case of health, there may be individuals that are better fit, better suited to judge what is best for an individual, though the individual may understand best out of anyone what his sense and what his perception of the warm, the dry, and the sweet are, which again may be different from another. It doesn't necessarily mean that his reality is different from another, but his experience of it is different from another. And in that difference, I think that there is perhaps some value. There at least is the recognition that there is a truth between the difference between individual experiences. But there's also the truth in recognizing that just because there are differences in individual experiences doesn't mean that the individual is always in the position in which he is best to judge. Socrates continues and he says, then consider political questions. Some of these are questions of what may or may not fittingly be done, of just and unjust, of pious and impious. And here the theory may be prepared to maintain that whatever view a city takes on these matters and establishes as its law or convention is truth and fact for that city. In such matters neither any individual nor any city can claim superior wisdom. But when it is a question of laying down what is to the interest of the state and what is not, the matter is different. The theory will again admit that here, if anywhere, one counselor is better than another. Here the decision of one city may be more in conformity with the truth than that of another. It would certainly not have the hardihood to affirm that when a city decides with a certain thing is to its own interest, that thing will undoubtedly turn out to be to its interest. It is in those other questions I am talking about, just and unjust, pious and impious, that men are ready to insist that no one of these things has by nature any being of its own. In respect of these, they say, what seems to people collectively to be so is true at any time when it seems that way, and for just as long as it so seems. And even those who are not prepared to go all the way with Protagoras take some such view of wisdom. But I see, Theodorus, that we are becoming involved in a greater discussion, emerging from the lesser one. So what can be said here? I think there is a lot of important information that Socrates is saying. But before we get into that, I think I'd like to point out just one thing I would think that would be good to keep at the front of one's mind. it is this idea of competence, what it means to be competent, into a state of competence. And it comes at the end of the last paragraph, when Socrates says, "Here it might well be admitted that it is not true that every creature, woman or child, or even animal, is competent to recognize what is good for it and to heal its own sickness. That here, if anywhere, one person is better than another." And so I choose to mention that again, because it's important to understand what it means for one to be better than another, to make a judgment at one thing. This will undoubtedly come up again, but the reason that one is better than another to make a judgment is because they know something that the other person does not know. That thereby the judgment of this person would be lesser than the judgment of somebody that knows because of their lack of knowing. And so there has to be something in the process of knowing, or in the condition of having known something, or knowing something, that then allows us to make the declaration that there is a betterness, that there is a difference between the two conditions, that the improvement of judgment towards a direction of, let's say, healthfulness, an understanding of what action needs to be done in order for a state of health to improve, is what is valuable in this circumstance. Now that may be self-explanatory, that may seem obvious. But again, as the discussion evolves and it becomes more sophisticated, I think it becomes more and more difficult to understand exactly where we are and why it is better to have somebody in a place of authority that their judgment is considered to be more valuable or better than another's. And of course, this gets to the heart of what we're talking about here, because this whole dialogue, Theaetetus, is about epistemology. It is about knowing. And so here I'd like to take a moment and talk about something that's hopefully related to this paragraph that I'd like to get into again and talk about. So let's take the example of temperature. I may have used this example before, I don't remember. But in terms of perception, just like the perception of pain, or similar to the perception of pain, I suppose, temperature can be seen as, or the perception of hot and coldness, let's say, can be something that is relative. We might say today that it is subjective. I would say that it is the case that what is hot and what is cold is somewhat determined by convention. You may have an individual that says something is hot up to the degree which it is tolerable, but they may feel the warmth before then, but yet may not consider it to be hot. And this hotness they consider to be the threshold of something that is dangerous. And the same with the cold. And there may be other individuals that exist under different conventions that may consider coldness and hotness to have a much less, the threshold to be much less. Meaning that what they consider to be hot and consider to be cold is met before that stimulus is potentially dangerous to the individual. Now those characterizations and those distinctions really don't matter all that much for what I'm going to outline here, but it is nonetheless an interesting thing to think about. And even though that these things are representations, or even though that these things are seemingly what we might say subjective, and thereby not all that reliable in terms of reports, or in terms of evidence. They are the experience of man. They are what we know of hotness and coldness. And because of our experience of this hotness and coldness, we can determine, thereby, temperature. We can remove our experience from the equation, and we can give some objective standard to it and say that temperature is the measure of average molecular motion, kinetic molecular motion. And the thing here is that since we have removed our experience, what is considered to be hot and cold here no longer really has any place. It's more of the physical phenomena that happens at certain ranges of molecular motion. We can have a change in phase of an object from a solid to a liquid, or a liquid to a solid. In the case of freezing, melting, boiling, all this sort of thing, boiling a liquid to a gas, perhaps. All of these things occur at different temperatures, and yet we don't attribute hotness or coldness to these specific physical phenomena. Now, freezing or boiling may be considered to us in our experience to be hot or cold, but in like a physical laboratory setting, our experience and our characterization of our experiences in that environment has no place. But not everywhere is a laboratory, not everywhere is a controlled setting. And everywhere we are, whether we like it or not, bound to our own experiences. We are human beings that exist within the machine, the mechanism that we exist within. And so not only does this apply to things like hotness and coldness and an objective standard that we might make, such as temperature, but it also applies to things like just, unjust, pious, and impiousness. And so Socrates here says, the theory may be prepared to maintain that whatever view a city takes on these matters and establishes as its law or convention is truth and fact for that city. So it's a matter of level here, because it's saying at the level of the city has its experience, since it's made up of more fundamental elements of these machines that have their own experiences that reflect reality. Now, of course, that their relationship to that reality is perceived in a certain way. It's consistent for the most part among individuals, although there is some variability. And so our judgments are, in many respects, based on our relationship to reality. My judgment about how long I'm going to place my hand on the countertop is going to be dependent on my relationship between the countertop and my hand. If the countertop, let's say I put my hand on a surface that is the stove, and the stove is on, let's say it's an electric stove, nice flat surface, the stove is on, my hand gets burned, I'm going to move it away because of my understanding and the information that I take in from the environment and that relationship that I have, or did have, with the surface. Now, of course, the surface was intolerable. I could have kept my hand there and allowed it to be burned if I had the strength and the will to do so. A strange thing to want to do, But because the relationship was such that it was antagonistic to my being, or to the health of, again, me, the individual, I chose to move my hand away from the surface. Now, similarly, this relationship must exist at the level of the city, and also include matters of justice and injustice, or unjust, and pious and impious. And he says, when here the theory may be prepared to maintain that whatever view a city takes on these matters and establishes as its law or conventions is truth and fact for that city, we can say that there is some relativism, there is some subjectivism, there may be some falsities here. But we also have to remember that individuals do experience reality. And we also, again, at the same time, have to appreciate that there are individuals that are devoted to understanding the broader picture in spite of our relationship to reality. In spite of our, I'll just leave it there, our relationship to reality. Now, I'm not making any definite statements yet. I'm trying to narrow down something that Socrates may be trying to get at. In such matters, neither any individual nor any city can claim superior wisdom. In such matters, neither any individual nor any city can claim superior wisdom. But when it is a question of laying down what is to the interest of the state and what is not, the matter is different. Now, why is it the case that in the former sentence that no individual can take or claim superior wisdom? And in my opinion here, it would seem that this would be the case because human beings and their collectives experience the world in a similar way. Now, again, there is variability, but there's always variability. The amount of perspectives that we can take to analyze an object are infinite. But the hardware and the software that we run is consistent. And so for an individual to claim that they have different hardware or different software, I think that this would be nonsensical, and it would not be superior or inferior. And even if there is the possibility, there is always the case that there are more intelligent people, the people that their software program runs a little bit more swiftly than in others, or perhaps due to accident or due to genetics or a person's makeup, that sense perception can change a bit, and that can influence their understanding of reality. Someone may be born blind, for example, or the inability to hear. But of the general normal population, their experience is relatively similar. And just like our analogy between temperature and the perception of hotness and coldness, I think this relationship might be analogous to what is being described here. That we have a hotness and coldness understanding to reality, because this is inherently our relationship to it. it being reality. And we also have a hotness and coldness relationship in matters of justice, injustice, piousness, and impiousness. Now, where exactly temperature is on that scale, I think, is just the observation without the human component, which is almost impossible to tell. And exactly what we would call justice and just and unjust, or piousness and impiousness without the relational aspect, I'm not too sure. When I say without the relational aspect, I mean there is an obvious part of temperature and of the scientific process that is relational. It's just very controlled. And I think that the control for the externalities, or the extraneous variables, is a thing that limits one's experience. Now there's good and bad that go with that. But the only reason that I mention that is to say that of the individual experience, we can go quite far in terms of our limiting the mistakes of the individual senses and perception, but we are always a part of a story. So the point at which I remove my hand from a hot surface and consider it to be hot, I am imagining that in a like manner to that of a state that keeps the metaphorical hand, the metaphorical stand of the metaphorical hand of the state on what is considered to be hot, or just, unjust, pious, and impious. The hot in this case would be something that goes against a degree of piety or a degree of justice such that there are harmful consequences. That would be the parallel there. And just like our experience with hotness and coldness, that there is a bit of a relativism there, and there is some human will component that's wound up into it, and certainly convention. People that live up north in Canada versus people that live down south in Texas have surely different thresholds and different tolerances to what is hot and what is cold. But yet there are, I think, reasonable boundaries among the population of human beings that would agree that certain things are just cold and some things are just hot, especially given a certain framework, a framework, something that a relevance framework that they can draw from. Because these days, certainly, we don't experience the type of hotness or coldness that would limit our participation in society. We have such a degree of material prosperity that these concerns are no longer a concern. We have climate-controlled buildings. That being said, the parallel still exists. The parallel that we have the sense ability in the organs to sense the temperature changes so that we can take in the information from the environment to influence our decisions, just as we do the ability to take in information about what is potentially harmful at the level of the just and piety that may impact and influence our livelihood. And it's not just a matter of negative influence. We also have positive influence. We want to live in a place that is just, and we want to, I think most of us at some level would want to live in a society that is geared toward the good correctly, and thereby being sort of pious individuals. A correct orientation to both their own personal trajectory, but also to their the relationship between the citizens and their fellow citizens and their family members, more importantly. And so again, in such matters, neither any individual nor any city can claim superior wisdom. I may have to place a placeholder there, a bookmark, because it's a difficult statement to make. It's quite a large statement to make. But it is understandable, I think, as far as the analogy that we have used goes. But then, when we get down to the individual components, the ones that are actually of the individuals that are actually involved in making the on-the-ground decisions, but when it is a question of laying down what is to the interest of the state and what is not, the matter is different. The theory will again admit that here, if anywhere, the one counselor is better than another. Here, the decision of one city may be more in conformity with the truth than that of the other. And so what is the difference in condition between one counselor being wiser or better than another and that of the level of the city and its convention? And this may not be the correct analogy, but I'll continue with the temperature example, or at least the example to the body in general. In terms of the absolute, in terms of what is, I think there are certain concrete things that we can rely on. Now, we have already discussed the potential pitfalls and dangers with the mechanism that perceives, but the thing that it is perceiving is relatively consistent. There's not a lot of falsity. There's not a sophist that exists in every molecule to disrupt the senses of the more advanced organism that contains many different molecules, many different cells and organs that interact to function as one unit. But I think that the degree to which, now it's difficult because I want to make a comparison here between the wisdom, let's say, of the sensory organs and the wisdom of the counselor. It's not quite the same thing, but the analogy would be the fundamental trait that is being sensed by the body would be parallel to the fundamental duty that the counselor has to the level of the state, because the organ at the level of the body has sort of that function to the level of the man. Now, the difference is that it's up a degree in terms of the counselor. It is beyond just the base fundamental sense perception, and we're dealing with a man that is contributing his knowledge and understanding to the level of the state. And so it's like it's a Russian doll type scenario. But again, for the counselor to have an accurate understanding of the ebb and flow of the society and the culture, it is necessary for him to make a decision, just like it's necessary for a sensory organ to understand the ebb and flow of the natural world and environment for us to make an appropriate decision about what to, or what not to do. Again, the example of what is hot and what is cold here is appropriate, because it can keep us safe, but it can also improve our condition, our material condition, assuming that we understand enough about our surroundings to manipulate it. And from that, it might be better to use an analogy that is more, that integrates more than one sense than just hotness or coldness, let's say, but all of the senses that are integrated into this thing, they're then used by the individual to form a perception and opinions and ideas about the actions that one should take. So here, the decision of one city may be more in conformity with the truth than that of another. So again, this dialogue is about knowing, and it is thereby extension about what is true, retaining the truth within the mind to know it. And so there are questions that come up there, then, okay, so the decision of that city being more conformed with the truth than that of the other, does it mean that they are using a relatively arbitrary framework? Arbitrary in the sense, well, it's not arbitrary, it's based on reality, but the way it's perceived is not even that, because the way that it is perceived is true given a certain view. I think I am so accustomed to viewing things from the subject-object in terms of the scientific worldview that it's difficult to see outside of it. But if you see it from within, and you're able to control from within, so as not to be misguided by your own perceptions, then I think that well, what do I think? I think it's possible that one can come to conclusions that are not necessarily, again, it's a frame shift, because if I would have to jump back into the modern frame to make the comparison. But if I tried to stay within the other frame, which is the frame of pure participation in this world, in this reality, rather than just sort of viewing my being and everybody else's being and the ebb and flow of society from the outside, from sort of the individual as the observer looking in, rather than me existing as something in the world and looking out at it, it can be kind of difficult to articulate exactly where I stand in terms of understanding what Socrates is trying to say here. Socrates says, "It would certainly not have the hardihood to affirm that when a city decides that a certain thing is to its own interest, that thing will undoubtedly turn out to be to its interest. It is in those other questions I am talking about, just and unjust, pious and impious, that men are ready to insist that no one of these things has by nature any being of its own. In respect of these, they say, what seems to people collectively to be so is true. At the time when it seems the way, and for just as long as it seems. And even those who are not prepared to go all the way with Protagoras take some such view of wisdom. But I see, Theodorus, that we are becoming involved in a greater discussion emerging from the lesser one. Yeah, we certainly are. So this is quite a dense paragraph, but I think we are making some headway here. So this idea and this comparison between the just and unjust, pious and impious, to that of hot and coldness in terms of perception, I think is good. We'll stick with that for a while until we find something better. Because, again, I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but just in terms of consistency, the hot and cold analogy, this is, again, a representation of a reality, although there is variability between the individuals, because it's not a set in stone thing, let's say. It's not a purely mathematical, it doesn't live in the mathematical world of perfection, let's say, but it is based off a machine that can illustrate and mirror this sort of type of exact computation, perhaps. Now the question of, is the universe computational? That would be interesting. It would certainly have something to say about everything is in motion and of the generative principle. Well, let's see if we get there or not. So this last bit of this paragraph here, there's a lot that we should unpack. So we were seeing, I think, two different things emerge here. Well, more than two things, but two main things that come to mind initially. One is the limitation of the theory. Because, Socrates says it would certainly not have the hardihood, it being the theory, would not have the hardihood to affirm that when a city decides that a certain thing is to its own interest, that thing will undoubtedly turn out to be to its interest. Again, it's not lost in this relativism. There are people that are actually have some relationship to the state. They make up the state. They are the state in a certain regard. And so the individual vested interest, just as my individual interest, not just my opinion of the hot and cold, but my experience of the hot and cold actually does matter for me. And so again, then he goes into the next statement. It is in those other questions I'm talking about, the just, unjust, pious, and impious, that men are ready to insist that no one of these things has by nature any being of its own in respect of these. They say that what seems to people collectively they say what seems to people collectively to be so is true at the time when it seems that way, and for just as long as it seems. So what does that statement mean? So step by step, if we are talking about a particular class of people with a particular opinion about the just and unjust, pious and impious, he says there are men that are ready to insist that no one of these things, just, unjust, pious, impious, has by nature any being of its own. Now, what would it mean for something to have a being of its own? By nature, have a being of its own. So by nature, meaning that there is something fundamental within the makeup of the term that we call just, unjust, pious, impious, that has actually some grounding in nature and reality. And the difficulty is determining when the relationship leaves earth and enters into heaven, or when it leaves heaven and enters into earth. But that just might be the issue. It is the relationship. It is the being in relation to these things that causes it to be salient to the individual. Again, the hotness and coldness example. In respect of these, just, unjust, pious, impious, they say what seems to people collectively to be so is true. So this could mean sort of more of a scientific type approach. Perhaps not. But if you're talking about the belief of an individual that is observing something from a collective standpoint, I think it's easy to see the movement of the just and the unjust and the pious and the impious. I think we often talk about societies, civilizations, and their movement throughout vast periods of time in order to make judgments about the correctness or incorrectness of their behavior. But again, this is an observational view. So again, in respect of these, they say what seems to people collectively to be so is true. At the time when it seems that way. At the time when it seems that way. And for just as long as it seems so. So what is he saying here? It's dependent on the moment? When something appears or seems to be hot, then it is hot. And just as long as it lasts, it seems that way. This is difficult to interpret for me. And even those who are not prepared to go all the way with Protagoras take some such view of wisdom. So I think continuing into this conversation is going to unveil a lot more. Theodorus says, well, we have plenty of time, haven't we, Socrates? Socrates continues and he says, we appear to. That remark of yours, my friend, reminds me of an idea that has often occurred to me before. How natural it is that men who have spent a great part of their lives in philosophical studies make such fools of themselves when they appear as speakers in the law courts. Theodorus says, how do you mean now? Well, look at the man who has been knocking about in law courts and such places ever since he was a boy, and compare him with the man brought up in philosophy, in the life of a student. It is surely like comparing the upbringing of a slave with that of a free man. Theodorus says, how is that now? Because the one man always has what you mentioned just now, plenty of time. When he talks in peace and quiet, and his time is his own. It is so with us now. Here we are beginning on our third new discussion, and he can do the same if he is like us and prefers the newcomer to the question in hand. It does not matter to such men whether they talk for a day or a year, if only they hit upon that which is. But the other, the man of the law courts, is always in a hurry when he is talking. He has to speak with one eye on the clock. Besides, he can't make his speeches on any subject he likes. He has his adversary standing over him, armed with the compulsory powers and with the sworn statement, which is read out point by point as he proceeds. It must be kept to by the speaker. The talk is always about a fellow slave, and is addressed to a master who sits there holding some suit or other in his hand. And the struggle is never a matter of indifference. It always directly concerns the speaker, and sometimes life itself is at stake. Such conditions make him keen and highly strung, skilled in flattering the master and working his way into favor, but cause his soul to be small and warped. His early servitude prevents him from making a free, straight growth. It forces him into doing crooked things by imposing dangers and alarms upon a soul that is still tender. He cannot meet these by just and honest practice, and so resorts to lies and to the policy of repaying one wrong with another. Thus he is constantly being bent and distorted, and in the end grows up to manhood with a mind that has no health in it, having now become in his own eyes a man of ability and wisdom. There is your practical man, Theodorus. What about our own set? Would you like us to have a review of them, or shall we let them be and return to the argument? We don't want to abuse this freedom to change our subject, of which we were speaking just now. Theodorus says, No, Socrates, let us review the philosophers. What you said just now was quite right. We who move in such circles are not the servants, but the masters of our discussions. Our arguments are our own, like slaves. Each one must wait about for us, to be finished whenever we think fit. We have no jury and no audience, as the dramatic poets have, sitting in control over us, ready to criticize and give orders. Socrates says, "Very well then, we must review them, it seems, since you have made up your mind. But let us confine ourselves to the leaders. Why bother about the second-rate specimens? To begin with, then, the philosopher grows up without knowing the way to the marketplace, or the whereabouts of the law courts, or the council chambers, or any other place of public assembly. Laws and decrees, published orally or in writing, are things he never sees or hears. The scrambling of political cliques for office, social functions, dinners, parties with flute girls, such doings never enter his head, even in a dream. So with questions of birth, he has no more idea whether a fellow citizen is high-born or humble, or whether he has inherited some taint from his forebears, male or female, than he has of the number of pints in the sea, as they say. And in all these matters, he knows not even that he knows not, for he does not hold himself aloof from them in order to get a reputation, but because it is in reality only his body that lives and sleeps in the city, his mind having come to the conclusion that all these things are of little or no account, spurns them, and pursues its winged way. As Pindar says, throughout the universe, in the deeps beneath the earth, the geometrizing its surfaces in the heights above the heaven, astronomizing and tracking down by every path the entire nature of each whole among the things that are, never condescending to what lies near at hand. And Theaetetus says, "What do you mean by that, Socrates?" So let's pause here for a moment and discuss what was said previously. I'd like to talk about the conversation that Socrates was having about the lawyer. This man, he said, was the practical man. And so this question arises sort of at the end of the paragraph in which he's talking about this person. And we can get into the specifics in a moment, but the first question I had, well, what is this practical man? And we just finished talk about how his soul has sort of been bent and twisted because of the behavior that he is forced into because of his occupation. But Socrates considers this the practical man. Perhaps it's a tongue-in-cheek practical man, but nonetheless, what is the practical man? Now, practical, just a straight definition, is of or concerned with the actual doing or use of something rather than with theory and ideas. Another definition, likely to exceed or be effective in real circumstances, feasible. Some synonyms: empirical, hands-on, pragmatic, real, actual, active, applied. Now, the practical man in totality, I would have to imagine that this is not true across the board, because it can't be in every case that the applied man, the man that is concerned with doing, is always the man who will grow up to have the soul that is twisted. But it is a particular type of man in society that we consider to be a practical man, a man that does do things with his mind, an intellectual skill. Like the lawyer, he practices law, he works on defenses, he works on arguments. He doesn't do it on his own accord, as Socrates says. And there are instances for which the job requires him to bend the truth, to go after the argument that suits him best, regardless of the truth. That produces a bit of a sophist in this person. Now, it's a difficult, perhaps a fine line to consider a practical man, the one that does not deal in theory, does not deal in the realm of abstraction. Because the lawyer certainly deals with abstraction. Now, he uses his mental skills for a particular directed purpose. The philosopher, as Socrates says, this type of man, it doesn't matter to such men whether they talk for a day or a year, if only they may hit upon that which is. They're concerned primarily with the truth. But the other, the man of the law courts, is always in a hurry when he is talking. He has to speak with one eye on the clock. Besides, he can't make his speeches on any other subject, on any subject that he likes. He has his adversary standing over him, armed with compulsory powers, and with the sworn statement, which is read out point by point as he proceeds, and must be kept. It must be kept to by the speaker. The talk is always about a fellow slave, and is addressed to a master, who sits there holding some suit or other in his hand. And the struggle is never a matter of indifference. It always directly concerns the speaker, and sometimes life itself is at stake. Now, there may be a slight difference here between the Athenian courts and the modern-day courts in the United States, and exactly what capacity this man of the law courts has is uncertain. At once it seems that this is the man that occupies a profession like the legal profession, like a lawyer would today. But on the other hand, it seems as though it's possible that this is a person who is defending himself or defending somebody else. When Plato mentions that it's always about a fellow slave and is addressed to a master, it seems to suggest that this position, this defensible position, is coming from a man of a lower status, someone that is bound by this position, that he must always make arguments. The struggle is never a matter of indifference. It always directly concerns the speaker, and sometimes life itself is at stake. So here is where I question whether or not, is this person defending themselves? Because if they are, then life itself certainly could be at stake. And certainly there are no shortage of lawyers where the struggle to convict is a matter of indifference. It is just their job, their duty to do it. But if it is the defense of the person who is accused, and the person who is accused must defend themselves, then certainly it is never a matter of indifference. But what I see within that circumstance certainly would be a person that's forced into thinking quite deeply about the nature of their position. That meaning, if it is again the person who had committed a crime and is defending himself, then certainly this would prompt the individual into a situation. It would afford a situation, it would afford a state of mind, and a particular type of desperation. And I would have to imagine that there would be certain conclusions that one would come to rather quickly because of the sort of existential flame that is lit beneath them. Yet, in the other circumstance in which this is sort of a person who is doing this as a profession, we can certainly see that this person would be restricted to the rules of the courts. They would be restricted by convention. Not saying that this is necessarily a bad thing, but that there is a trade-off between the position of a man and the use of his mind in that profession and in that environment versus that of a philosopher who is free to think as he pleases, so long as he is after the truth. And in the second paragraph here, Plato mentions the conditions. Now the conditions make him keen and highly strung, skilled in flattering and master, and working his ways into favor. But all of these conditions, they cause his soul to be small and warped. The soul, perhaps from the Platonic perspective, being the reasoned mind, the spirited aspect, perhaps encompassing emotions, courage, ambition, honor. And all of the inferior drives, the hunger, the thirst, the wakefulness, the sleepiness. Again, the conditions that this individual finds himself in cause his soul to be small and warped. His early servitude prevents him from making a free, straight growth. It forces him into doing crooked things by imposing dangers and alarms upon a soul that is still tender. Perhaps it would imply here that the man of the court is a type of servant or slave that works in that position, outlining arguments perhaps as a part of his sentence or as a part of his duty, but he is bound to do so due to the nature of his relationship to the master. But perhaps this is not right. Perhaps the servitude just seems to imply his duty and that he is a free man. Because certainly this position is an elevated position. It is a thinking man's position. It forces him into doing crooked things by imposing dangers and alarms upon a soul that is still tender. So what's being described here is a young person that is growing into the profession. And it's interesting because this young person that grows into manhood is constantly shaped by the poor decisions that he is required to make due to the nature of the situation, due to the conditions. If anything, it highlights the importance of the conditions and the role that they play on the human mind as it develops. He says he cannot meet these by just and honest practice, and so resorts to lies and to the policy of repaying one wrong with another. Thus he is constantly being bent and distorted. and in the end grows up to manhood with a mind that has no health in it, having now become in his own eyes a man of ability and wisdom. So in other words, in his own eyes he is lying to himself. He believes that his ability and wisdom are things that are not ability, or I should say true ability or true wisdom. In contrast, Socrates speaks of the philosopher, and the image that we get is of a person of the similar trajectory of a young man that moves up into adulthood, but unlike the man of the law courts, this person has a certain aloofness to him about local matters, but a very deep will and desire to explore matters that are far beyond him, far beyond the city in which he lives. He says, and in all these matters he knows not even that he knows not, for he does not hold himself aloof from them in order to get a reputation, but because in reality only his body that lives and sleeps in the city. His mind, having come to the conclusion that all things are of little or no account, spurns them and pursues its winged way. As Pindar says, throughout the universe, in the deeps beneath the earth, and geometrizing its surfaces, in the heights above the heaven, astronomizing and tracking down by every path the entire nature of each whole among the things that are, never condescending to what lies near at hand. Now here Theodorus says, what do you mean by that, Socrates? Socrates continues and he says, well, here's an instance. They say Thales was studying the stars, Theodorus, and gazing aloft, when he fell into a well, and a witty and amusing Thracian servant girl made fun of him, because, she said, he was wild, and to know about what was up in the sky, but failed to see what was in front of him, and under his feet. The same joke applies to all who spend their lives in philosophy. It really is true that the philosopher fails to see his next-door neighbor. He not only doesn't notice what he is doing, he scarcely knows whether he is a man or some other kind of creature. The question he asks is, what is man? What actions and passions properly belong to human nature and distinguish it from all other beings? This is what he wants to know and concerns himself to investigate. You see what I mean, Theodorus, don't you? Theodorus says yes. And what you mean and what you say is true. This accounts, my friend, for the behavior of such a man when he comes into contact with his fellows, either privately with individuals or in public life, as I was saying at the beginning. Whenever he is obliged in a law court or elsewhere to distinguish the things that lie at his feet and before his eyes, he causes entertainment not only to Thracian servant girls, but to all the common herd, by tumbling into wells and every sort of difficulty through his lack of experience. His clumsiness is awful, and gets him a reputation of fatuousness. On occasion, when personal scandal is the topic of conversation, he never has anything at all of his own to contribute. He knows nothing to the detriment of anyone, never having paid any attention to the subject. A lack of resource, which makes him look very comic. And again, when compliments are in order, and self-laudation, his evident amusement, which is by no means a pose but perfectly genuine, is regarded as idiotic. When he hears the praises of a despot or a king being sung. It sounds to his ears as if some stock breeder were being congratulated. Some keeper of pigs or sheep, or cows that are giving him plenty of milk. Only he thinks that the rulers have a more difficult and treacherous animal to rear and milk, and that such a man, having no spare time, is bound to become quite and coarse, and uncultivated as the stock farmer. For the castle of the one is much a prison as the mountain fold of the other. When he hears talk of land, that so and so has a property of 10,000 acres or more, and what a vast property that is, it sounds to him like a tiny plot, used as he is to envisage the whole earth. When his companions become lyric on the subject of great families, and exclaim that the noble blood of one who can appoint to 7 wealthy ancestors, he thinks that such praise comes of a dim and limited vision, and inability, through lack of education, to take a steady view of the whole, and to calculate that every single man has countless hosts of ancestors, near and remote, among whom are to be found, in every instance, rich men and beggars, kings and slaves, Greeks and foreigners, by the thousand. When men pride themselves upon a pedigree of 25 ancestors, and trace their descendants back to Heracles, the son of Amphitryon, they seem to him to be taking a curious interest in trifles. As for the 25th ancestor of Amphitryon, what he may have been merely a matter of luck, and similarly with the 15th before him again, how ridiculous he thinks, not to be able to work that out, and get rid of the gaping vanity of a silly mind. All of these occasions, you see, the philosopher is the object of general derision, partly for what men take to be his superior manner, and partly for his constant ignorance and lack of resource in dealing with the obvious. Theodorus says, "What you say exactly describes what happens, Socrates." It's quite the critique that Plato has of, or Socrates has, of the philosopher. It seems as though there is, especially when Socrates says that last statement, on all these occasions you see the philosopher is the object of general derision, partly for what men take to be his superior manner, and partly for his constant ignorance and lack of resource in dealing with the obvious. Now that last statement there, partly for his constant ignorance and lack of resource in dealing with the obvious, it's not just his clumsiness. It's not just the analogy of him falling into the well, not looking directly what's in front of him. In many of the cases that were mentioned, the critique of the philosopher is viewing things from above, let's say. And it's not quite just above. It is at a certain level. And to Plato's point here, that the ignorance comes in because of this jump in levels, always existing and always observing from a certain point, a certain vantage point. And as a result of that, I think, just like in the modern day with many strict materialists, there is a tendency to overly reduce things or to view things too highly, and from these vantage points we forget that we are active participants in the world that we live in. And although we can imagine things above a certain level, above a certain conversation, perhaps. If we do these things, not only will we be the object of derision, as Plato says here, but we will fail to get any sort of meaning out of anything that is spoken and in the moment, because we're always somewhere else. We are never present. We are never the actor, just the observer. Because I think about the example of the descendants. Somebody brings up the example or the topic of discussion about coming from a particular line of a particular family, perhaps. And then the contrarian or perhaps the philosopher comes in and says, well, this is nothing. We just keep on going back farther and farther. It doesn't mean anything. But at a certain point, it does mean something. There are definite categories and characteristics, lineages that have meant something, that mean something to societies present and societies of old. They've had entire dynastic changes that have changed the culture at the end of a line. Likewise, today, we have many strong and powerful families that mean something to the world that we inhabit. And it's not only the people that have wealth. From our own personal perspective, I mentioned being the active participant in our reality. Well, we all come from somewhere. We all have a familial story. And that means something at that level. But the point is that we have to recognize that we may hold an opinion, but that opinion, just because we hold it and we can recognize that there is a higher level, whatever that may look like, doesn't give us the excuse to pretend that operating at one level versus being introduced to a conversation at another level is an excuse for undeserved righteousness or impious behavior. Because I think at the core of the contrarian, there is this divisive nature. Even if the contrarian wants to come to something that is greater, at a certain point he'll be unable to bring down heaven to the level of man. It's just plain and simple. We can do what we can with the heavenly principle, but it is limited. And I think that the virtue of humility comes in at this point. So again, Theodorus says, what you say exactly describes what does happen, Socrates. Socrates says, but consider what happens, my friend, when he in his turn draws someone to a higher level and induces him to abandon questions of my injustice towards you or towards me for an examination of justice and injustice themselves, what they are and how they differ from everything else and from each other. Or again, when he gets him to leave such questions as whether a king who possesses much gold is happy, for an inquiry into kingship and into human happiness and misery in general, what these two things are, and what, for a human being, is the proper method by which one can be obtained and the other avoided. When it is an account of matters, like all these that is demanded of our friend with the small, sharp, legal mind, the situation is reversed. His head swims as, suspended at such a height, he gazes down from his place among the clouds, disconcerted by the unusual experience. He knows not what to do next, and can only stammer when he speaks. And that causes great entertainment, not to the Thracian servant girls or any other uneducated person. They do not see what is going on, but to all men who have not been brought up like slaves. So that's another interesting point. that Socrates brings up here. And I suppose before we go any further, I think it is appropriate to mention that I did not mean to suggest that just because we are able to see these higher levels that we were talking about, that we should not pursue them, or that they are not good. But it's a matter of integration. That's all my point is. We don't want to be the thinking man should not be the man that is the arrogant man. The thinking man should be the man that understands his place, understands his efforts in the moment, perhaps to climb the rungs of that ladder. But if he is introduced by another man to a different ladder, or to a different staircase, let's say, to a different path, it is up to him to follow the man where that man wants to go, and not to break him down before they can even go anywhere. I should mention the quote here. When it is an account of matters like all these that is demanded of our friend with the small, sharp, legal mind, the situation is reversed. So instead of the opinion against the philosopher being this, foolish, well, maybe not foolish, but clumsy person, sort of an odd person that doesn't see the obvious, is always overthinking things. But now the philosopher has brought him into his world, let's say, and it's almost as if the tables are reversed. Now the opinion is in the philosopher's court. And instead of providing a just interaction with the individual, it's now a matter of amusement to see the person struggle and have difficulty with otherwise concepts that seemed simple, that were conventional. We go about our lives, we take things for granted until we question the fundamentals of them. He gazes down from his place among the clouds. So now he's at this higher level. He's up in the clouds. Disconcerted by the unusual experience, he knows not what to do next, and can only stammer when he speaks. And that causes great entertainment. And so this is the point that I was making. The philosopher has brought him to a new level, but perhaps too quickly, because now he stammers there, he's uncertain. Instead of being the guide, he is the hangman. Rather than moving to a new height, to progress and elevate the individual and the soul, he has moved him to a height to use gravity against him, again, to hang him by a rope, to see him struggle. Socrates says, these are the two types, Theodorus. There is the one who has been brought up in true freedom and leisure, the man you call a philosopher, a man to whom it is no disgrace to appear simple and good for nothing when he is confronted with menial tasks, when, for instance, he doesn't know how to make a bed, or how to sweeten a sauce, or a flattering speech. Then you have the other, the man who is keen and smart at doing all these jobs, but does not know how to strike up a song in his turn, like a free man, or how to tune the strings of common speech to the fitting praise of the life of gods and of the happy among men. And so it's another good point that Socrates brings up here, because beyond the particular issues that I may personally have with the analogies are fine, it's just a strain of thought. If we move back to the origin and begin a new path, the broader point here is about the nature and the difference between the free mind and the one that is constrained by certain practices, constrained by, I like to say, certain conventions. But it's not just certain conventions. And again, the broader argument that we get into is, well, What is the matter with these conventions? Certainly they are useful. We have talked in great detail about the usefulness of convention. Much of what we consider, much of our society and our interaction with one another is based on convention. Without it, we wouldn't be able to understand one another. We would fall into this extreme of this descending chaos. Our bonds would be completely cut by our rapid descent into confusion and psychological decay. So I certainly don't suggest that convention is not a good thing, but there is another point. There's a finite point to be, or there is a buried point here. The point between the lines, perhaps. Not necessarily between the lines, it is explicit. It's entertainment, as he says, not to the Thracian servant girls or any other uneducated person. They do not see what is going on, but to all men who have not been brought up like slaves. This is the key point. It is the man who has been brought up like a slave. Now the lawman, or the man of the courts, it's a certain job of distinction. There's a certain prestige that goes with it. How can we say that this man is a slave? He's brought up like a slave. Again, the paragraph that we read before, all about the attributes, all about the things that this man goes through. And as he is brought into this profession, he makes certain sacrifices. He performs his duty at the expense of his own soul. His soul is weak, it's meager, it's twisted. Because of the call of the duty, the call to duty that his profession requires. The philosopher, on the other hand, was not raised this way. He's liberated from the constraints. And again, with the understanding that convention is important, it's a fundamental binding force of civil society, how can we square this circle? How do we integrate freedom, liberation of individual exploration, and the expansion of the soul, the understanding, some more of the human element of our being, and place it into things that can be quite rigid, such as a profession of a person of the courts, of the lawman, let's say. And certainly there's a trade-off with the philosopher too, because we have the statement, there is the one who has been brought up in true freedom and leisure, the man that you call a philosopher, a man to whom it is no disgrace to appear simple and good for nothing when he is confronted with menial tasks, when, for instance, he doesn't know how to make a bed, or how to sweeten a sauce, or a flattering speech. Again, you have the other man, the man who is keen and smart at doing all these jobs, but does not know how to strike up a song in his turn like a free man, or how to tune the strings of common speech to the fitting praise of the life of gods and of the happy among men. Theodorus says, Socrates, if your words convinced everyone, as they do me, there would be more peace and less evil on earth. Socrates says, but it is not possible, Theodorus, that evil should be destroyed, for there must always be something opposed to the good. Nor is it possible that it should have its seat in heaven, but it must inevitably haunt human life. and prowl about this earth. That is why a man should make all haste to escape from earth to heaven. And escape means of becoming as like a god as possible. And a man becomes like God when he becomes just and pious with understanding. But it is not at all an easy matter, my good friend, to persuade man that it is not for the reasons commonly alleged that one should try to escape from wickedness and pursue virtue. It is not in order to avoid a bad reputation and obtain a good one that virtue should be practiced and not vice. That, it seems to me, is only what men call old wives' talk. Now this goes back and touches, I think, on the thread that we had picked up on earlier, that there is this thread of disingenuousness, or the quality of being disingenuous, both on the philosopher's side and on the side of the practical man. And that if we choose the good, if we choose to pursue something to be good at it, we are choosing to pursue a good. But there are no shortage of areas within our pursuit, within our journey, that pin us to the earth, or more to the point, I should say, that it pins us to the environment that makes it possible for evil to invade our souls and to corrupt our pursuits. Or the goodness therein, or thereof. And so it is our responsibility to take the burden of what we are thrown into, from more of a Christian perspective, a sinful world that is temptation around every corner and ignorance around every corner. Because although it is a difficult thing to accept, sin is something that is independent of our knowing, I think. We can commit it and not know it, just as we can break a law and not know that we've broken the law. It's not an excuse not to know. But the responsibility is to orient the attention towards the good, towards heaven, towards God. And as one does that, over time he begins to surrender the things that perhaps he comes to know, and even the things that he does not yet know. But by doing and by being in a certain way, he has sort of inadvertently curbed much of the potential for the type of behavior that would lead him astray. Again, Socrates says, "But it is not at all an easy matter, my good friend, to persuade men that it is not for the reasons commonly alleged that one should try to escape from wickedness and pursue virtue. It is not in order to avoid a bad reputation and obtain a good one that virtue should be practiced, and not vice. That, it seems to me, is only what men call old wives' talk." Let us try to put the truth in this way. In God there is no sort of wrong whatsoever. He is supremely just. And the thing most like him is the man who has come as just as it lies in human nature to be. And it is here that we see whether a man is truly able or truly a weakling and a non-entity. For it is the realization of this that is genuine wisdom and goodness, while the failure to realize it is manifest folly and wickedness. Everything else that passes for ability and wisdom has a sort of commonness. And those who wield political power, a poor, cheap show. In the manual workers, a matter of mechanical routine. If, therefore, one meets a man who practices injustice and is blasphemous in his talk or in his life, the best thing for him by far is that one should never grant that there is any sort of ability about his unscrupulousness. Such men are ready enough to glory in the reproach, and think that it means not that they are mere rubbish, cumbering the ground to no purpose, but that they have the kind of qualities that are necessary for survival in the community. We must therefore tell them the truth, that their very ignorance of their true state fixes them the more firmly therein, for they do not know what is the penalty of injustice, which is the last thing of which a man should be ignorant. It is not that they suppose scourging and death, things which they may entirely evade in spite of their wrongdoing. It is a penalty from which there is no escape. Now there's a few things to be said of this paragraph. I think the first thing is that we have to remember that this is Socrates speaking. This is Plato writing. They are citizens of Athens. This is 300-400 BC. The predominant religion at this time is Greek polytheism. And yet here we see this overt reference to a way of thinking that is very central. It's very monotheistic. It refers to God in the singular, a capital G God. It's almost as if I'm reading a Christian text. Now this could have something to do with translation, but as it's written here, it is very monotheistic. That's the first point. Socrates says, I'm not sure if I have much to add here, but I think it's an important point to reiterate. In God there is no sort of wrong whatsoever. He is supremely just. And the thing most like him is the man who has become just as it lies in human nature to be, meaning that the ultimate is perfect, as it is the ultimate. Man does himself a service to serve the ultimate, to the best of his ability and to his nature, because by his nature he is unable to be that like the nature of God or the ultimate. The thing that is supremely just, supremely good. But again, it's not an excuse not to do or not to try, and not to be the best of his nature, by his nature. And Socrates says, it is here that we see whether a man is truly able or truly a weakling and a non-entity. So what exactly does this mean? And it is here, so it's within the understanding that God is supremely just. And the thing that is, again, talking about this idea of man being as best as he can be in the image of God, we could say. It is here that we see whether a man is truly able or truly a weakling and a non-entity. So in the face of God, what is he? Where are his efforts? What does he look like? What is his behavior? What does his actions look like? What do his thoughts look like? What does it mean to be a non-entity? Now, an entity is a thing with distinct and independent existence. It is existence, it is being. Now, if one does not have this realization that he is called to be this way and to serve in this manner, then he is considered to be weak, and his being is a non-entity. For it is the realization of this that is genuine wisdom and goodness, while the failure to realize it is manifest folly and wickedness. And what he says here is quite beautiful. Everything else that passes for ability and wisdom has a sort of commonness. That if we look in the sort of current cultural zeitgeist, and those who wield political power, a poor, cheap show, and the manual workers a matter of mechanical routine. And he says this as we imagine the face of the ultimate. That we are not comparing ourselves to the politicians. We're not comparing ourselves to the manual workers. In our day, the physicians, the engineers, the tradesmen. Certainly we can learn things from wise people. But even the wise people must learn and be subject to what is greater than themselves in order for them to continue to grow in wisdom and ability. If, therefore, one meets a man who practices injustice and is blasphemous in his talk or in his life, the best thing for him by far is that one should never grant that there is any sort of ability about his unscrupulousness. Such men are ready enough to glory the reproach, and think that it means not that they are mere rubbish, cumbering the ground to no purpose, but that they have the kind of qualities that are necessary for survival in the community. It's another powerful statement there that Socrates makes. He says that the ones that practice injustice and blasphemous, even if they justify to themselves that they are doing it because those are the qualities that are necessary for survival in the community, we, as sort of upright individuals, if we choose so to be, if we have this realization that Socrates is talking about, then we should never grant that there is any sort of ability about his unscrupulousness. Again, because he uses vice, injustice, and evil to achieve his own ends. And as we've just discussed earlier, in order to be the best that we can be, we have to give up our designs and our selfish desires, because they are inherently limited. We must therefore tell them the truth, that their very ignorance of their true state fixes them the more firmly therein, for they do not know what is the penalty of injustice, which is the last thing of which a man should be ignorant. Again, this goes back to what we were saying before about this not knowing of the sinful nature, but not allowing it to be an excuse to continue to live in such a way that is sinful. For they do not know what is the penalty of injustice, he says, which is the last thing of which a man should be ignorant. Because justice will be the thing that corrects him, and if he is living in injustice, then when he is corrected, it will be a severe correction. And it's not so much that the individual should live justice so that they avoid judgment. But here we see the consequences, or the potential consequences, of being in a particular, or being a particular way. It says, "For they do not know what is the penalty of injustice." That their very ignorance of their true state fixes them the more firmly therein. More firmly therein, the state of ignorance. And so, it's easy to say, well, he's saying a bunch of stuff, but he's not really saying any specific concrete examples. That's not the point. The framework is enough to imagine specific examples. So if a man is firmly fixed in his ignorance, he is nothing more than an animal that lurks about, feeding off the scraps of others. He creates nothing for himself. He knows very little of the generative principle, the true generative principle. Perhaps he gets quite far with his own behavior and in his own society, his culture. Perhaps he's created a business for himself. At the level of the man, at the level of the soul, I think to be fixed so firmly at a level of selfishness, even if one succeeds, they could be quite exceptional individuals. They will be inherently limited. Their own lack of humility won't allow them to live to their fullest potential. They will be limited by the lesser, by the passions. They won't understand what it means to make true sacrifice, and through that sacrifice be judged in such a manner that is good, that is beneficial. And the connectedness and the general orientation of being is the reward. That is the wealth of the soul. It's the orientation of the being, and that fittedness, that connectedness. It is not what they suppose, scourging and death, things which they may entirely evade in spite of their wrongdoing. It is a penalty from which there is no escape. And Theodoret says, what is that? My friend, there are two patterns set up in reality. One is divine and supremely happy. The other has nothing of God in it, and is the pattern of the deepest unhappiness. This truth the evildoer does not see. Blinded by folly and utter lack of understanding, he fails to perceive that the effect of his unjust practices is to make him grow more and more like the one, and less like the other. For this he pays the penalty of living the life that corresponds to the pattern he is coming to resemble. And if we tell him that, unless he is delivered from his ability, delivered from this ability of his, when he dies, the place that is pure of all evil will not receive him, that he will forever go on living in this world a life after his own likeness, a bad man tied to bad company. He will but think, this is the way fools talk to a clever rascal like me. I think it's important here to remember that for many in our modern day, we can only see, at the level of the finite of the individual, and we can be quite selfish in the modern day, myself included. But this pattern doesn't stop or doesn't start at death. We don't have to get into the fanciful language of the afterlife and judgment therein, whatever that might look like to future generations or the remainder of the impact that the life of the individual had. But it also occurs, I think, throughout the individual's life. Opportunities are always given if one chooses to accept them. An opportunity may not look like more money or more wealth, and I think that's a difficult pill to swallow for many. Theodorus says, "Oh yes, Socrates, sure enough." Socrates says, "I know it, my friend, but there is one accident to which the unjust man is liable. When it comes to giving and taking an account in a private discussion of things he disparages, when he is willing to stand his ground like a man for long enough, instead of running away like a coward, then, my friend, an odd thing happens. In the end, the things he says do not satisfy even himself. That famous eloquence of his somehow dries up, and he's left looking nothing more than a child. But we had better leave it there. All this is really a digression, and if we go on, a flood of new subjects will pour in and overwhelm our original argument. So if you don't mind, we will go back to what we were saying before. So this is where I'll end this episode. We will continue next time with the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus.